Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a vessel that drifts through the void of space, so ancient and so immense that even the golden light of Sol itself seems dim by comparison. A vessel so large that it has been mistaken for a small moon or an asteroid caught in orbit around some forgotten world. A vessel that carries within its armored hull the collected history, the sacred relics, and the unbroken legacy of one of the most storied chapters of Space Marines to ever serve the Emperor of mankind. Its name is spoken with reverence by those who call it home, and with quiet dread by those who find themselves in its shadow. Its name is the Phalanx, and tonight we are going to talk about it, all of it. Every corridor, every battle honor, every scar upon its ancient hull. We are going to walk through the history of the single largest starship in the entire Imperium of man, a vessel that predates the Emperor's great dream of unification, and a fortress that has served as the home of the Imperial fists for more than 10,000 years. A weapon of such staggering power that it once destroyed a Blackstone fortress in a single, devastating volley. So, settle in, get comfortable, because the story of the Phalanx is the story of the Imperium itself, told through bulkheads and blast doors, through sacred shrines and silent armories, as through battles won and worlds saved, and heroes who gave everything they had so that humanity might endure one more day in the grim darkness of the far future. Let us begin where all great mysteries begin, in the dark, in the forgotten places where memory itself has crumbled to dust and only legend remains. Before the Emperor walked among men, before the Space Marine legions were a gleam in a geneticist's eye, before the Imperium of man existed at all, there was an age of wonders that humanity has spent 10,000 years trying to recapture and failing. The Dark Age of technology. It was a period stretching roughly from the 15th to the 25th millennium, a golden era when mankind's mastery of science and engineering reached heights that have never been equaled since. During those distant centuries, human civilization sprawled across the galaxy in a web of colony worlds, connected by stable warp routes and governed by artificial intelligences of terrifying sophistication. The machines of that age could reshape worlds, manipulate the fundamental forces of reality, and construct vessels of a scale and complexity that the Adeptus Mechanicus of the 41st millennium can only dream of replicating. It was during this era, and somewhere in the forgotten shipyards of a civilization that no longer exists, that the Phalanx was born. Now, the exact circumstances of the Phalanx's construction are one of those beautiful gaps in the lore that make the setting so compelling. The official records, such as they are, tell us only that the vessel was constructed during the Dark Age of technology by unknown hands. No blueprint survives, no manifest records who commissioned it or what yard laid its keel. No log describes its maiden voyage or the name of the captain who first stood upon its bridge and looked out through its viewports at the endless stars. All of that has been lost to the passage of time, swallowed by the catastrophic collapse of human civilization that followed the Dark Age, during the nightmarish period known as the Age of Strife. And this is important to understand, because it tells us something fundamental about the Phalanx that colors every aspect of its existence. This vessel is not Imperial technology. It was not designed by the Adeptus Mechanicus. It was not built according to the standard template constructs that form the technological bedrock of the Imperium's industrial capacity. The Phalanx is something older. Something from an age when humanity could build on a scale that the modern Imperium cannot comprehend, let alone reproduce. In many ways, it is comparable only to the craft worlds of the Aeldari, those continent-sized vessels that serve as the wandering homes of an entire species. The Phalanx is, quite simply, the closest thing humanity has ever produced to match those alien marvels. There is, however, a competing account of the Phalanx's origin. The author Dan Abnett, in his short story, The Lightning Tower, presents a different version of events, one in which the Phalanx was not a Dark Age relic at all, but was instead built by Rogal Dorn himself. as a testament to his unparalleled skill as a fortress builder and engineer. This version frames the Phalanx as the ultimate expression of Dorn's genius, a fortress not of stone and steel, planted upon a world's surface, but a fortress of the stars themselves, designed to carry the Imperial fists wherever duty demanded. Both accounts have their merits, and the lore has never definitively settled the question. The most widely accepted version is supported by the Index Astartes entries and the more recent 8th edition Codex supplement for the Imperial fists favors the Dark Age of technology origin. In this telling, the Phalanx was discovered by Rogal Dorn in orbit above the ice world of Inwit, derelict and dormant, a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. But the ambiguity is part of the vessel's mystique. Like so many things in the 41st millennium, the truth has been buried beneath layers of legend and contradiction, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Some mysteries are more powerful when they remain unsolved. What is worth dwelling on, though, is what the Dark Age of technology origin implies about the people who built the Phalanx. Consider the kind of civilization that would construct such a thing. Not a warship in any conventional sense, not a vessel designed with a single military purpose in mind, but a structure so vast and so self-sustaining that it could develop its own independent ecology. Or the builders of the Phalanx were not just engineers, they were world builders. They thought in terms of millennia, not years. They designed systems that could maintain themselves across spans of time so vast that entire civilizations could rise and fall before the first maintenance cycle came due. And then that civilization fell. The age of strife swept across the galaxy like a plague, cutting off human worlds from one another, plunging advanced societies into barbarism, and destroying the institutional knowledge that had made wonders like the Phalanx possible. The great ship, wherever it was when the old night descended, was left adrift, abandoned, forgotten. Its systems cycling down to standby mode, its corridors growing cold and dark, its purpose lost to the vagaries of a universe that had moved on without it. For thousands of years the Phalanx drifted, through asteroid fields and between the orbits of dead worlds, past the ruins of civilizations that had once been part of the same human commonwealth that had built it, through clouds of interstellar gas and the debris of ancient battles fought by people whose names no one would ever know. It drifted and it waited. Its machine spirits, those dim echoes of the artificial intelligences that had once managed its systems, kept the most basic functions running. Life support cycled on at its lowest setting. Power cells maintained a trickle charge. And navigation systems tracked the positions of stars that had shifted noticeably since the last time someone had stood on the bridge and plotted a course. And then, one day, a young man with golden skin and the genetic template of a god looked up from the frozen surface of an ice world and saw it hanging in the sky. A moon that was not a moon. A star that was not a star. A fortress waiting for a master who was worthy of it. Rogal Dorn had found the Phalanx. Or perhaps the Phalanx had found him. What we do know with certainty is that by the time the Emperor's Great Crusade reached the frozen hives of Inwit in the year 835 of the 30th millennium, the Phalanx was already under the command of Rogal Dorn. The Primarch of the 7th Legion, the man who would become known as the Praetorian of Terror, had spent years reactivating the dormant vessel, coaxing its ancient systems back to life, learning the secrets of its construction through patient study and relentless effort. And by the time his father found him, Dorn was standing at the helm of the largest and most powerful starship that anyone in the nascent Imperium had ever seen. And this brings us to one of the most significant moments in the Phalanx's long history, the meeting between father and son, between the Emperor of Mankind and the 7th of his 20 lost Primarchs. Picture this scene. The Great Crusade, that vast military undertaking to reunite the scattered colonies of humanity under a single banner, and had been pushing outward from Terra for decades. Fleet after fleet of Imperial warships, accompanied by the superhuman warriors of the Space Marine legions, had been breaking into new star systems, making contact with lost human civilizations, and bringing them into compliance with the Imperial truth. By the time the Crusade's outermost fleets reached the Inwit cluster, 7 of the 20 Primarchs had already been found and reunited with their gene father. Inwit itself was an ice world, a planet of frozen wastelands and towering hive structures where the population huddled against the killing cold in communities built around the principle of absolute, unyielding endurance. Rogal Dorn had been raised among these people, adopted by the ruler of a powerful clan, and through his superhuman abilities and indomitable will, had risen to become not just the master of his clan, but the ruler of the entire planet, and eventually the surrounding cluster of star systems. Yet he had forged the scattered, squabbling hive communities into a unified civilization, an empire of ice and iron held together by discipline, duty, and an expectation of service that would later become the defining characteristic of his Space Marine Legion. And at the center of that empire, orbiting above Inwit like a second moon, hung the Phalanx. When the Emperor's fleet arrived in the system, what they found was not a primitive warlord squatting on a frozen rock, but they found a Primarch who had already built a star-spanning domain, who commanded armies and fleets, and who greeted his gene father from the bridge of a vessel that dwarfed anything in the Imperial armada. The moment is described with a kind of quiet grandeur in the source material. Dorn standing at the helm of the Phalanx, the 7th Primarch to be found, welcoming the Emperor aboard and offering the great vessel as a gift. The Emperor declined. He recognized, perhaps, that the Phalanx was more than just a ship. It was an extension of Dorn himself, a manifestation of everything the Primarch represented: fortification, endurance, unbreakable resolve. Instead of accepting the gift, the Emperor returned the Phalanx to Dorn's care and transformed it into the mobile fortress monastery of the 7th Space Marine Legion, the Imperial Fists. Every warrior in that legion had been created using Dorn's own genetic template, and from that day forward, that the Phalanx would be their home, their sanctuary, their fortress in the stars. From the very first moment that Dorn and the Emperor met on the bridge of the Phalanx, the Primarch's loyalty was absolute. He never wavered. He never sought favor or reward. He never played the political games that consumed some of his brothers. Rogal Dorn believed in the Emperor's vision with a conviction that was as solid and unyielding as the walls he built. And the Phalanx became the physical embodiment of that conviction. A mobile fortress that could carry the Imperial Fists wherever the Emperor needed them, that could deploy an entire legion of Space Marines with speed and devastating force, and that could serve as a visible symbol of the Imperium's might to every world that fell under its shadow. And what a shadow it cast. Let us talk about the physical reality of the Phalanx, because the sheer scale of this vessel is almost impossible to grasp without taking a moment to truly consider what the source material is describing. The Phalanx is described, consistently across multiple sources, as being the size of a small moon or a large asteroid. That description alone should give you pause. We are not talking about a big ship. We are not talking about even the largest class of Imperial battleship, vessels that themselves can stretch for kilometers. But we are talking about an object so large that it has been mistaken for a celestial body. When the Phalanx enters a star system, it doesn't register on sensors as a ship. It registers as a new astronomical object. The vessel's foredeck alone, just the forward section where other ships dock and supplies are loaded, is large enough to accommodate a dozen Imperial Navy cruisers simultaneously around its circumference. Think about that. An Imperial cruiser is itself a massive warship, typically several kilometers in length, crewed by thousands of personnel, and the Phalanx can park 12 of them at its front door like small boats tied up at a pier. One source from the Lexicanum notes that the Phalanx easily eclipses even the gigantic penitence arcs and solar reliquaries of the Adeptus Ministorum, vessels that are themselves dozens of miles long. Its exterior has been described in several different ways across the novels and codex entries, which is fitting for a vessel so large that no single observer could take in the whole thing at once. Some descriptions speak of towering forests of spires interlaced with flying buttresses, giving the impression of a Gothic cathedral stretched across the void. Others describe it as many kilometers long, triangular in cross-section, with its upper surface bristling with weapons and sensor domes. Two wings sweep back from the hull, trailing directional vanes like long gilded feathers. Every surface is clad in solid armor plating, and every angle is covered by more torpedo tubes and lance batteries than any Imperial battleship could muster. There is a description that captures the vessel's appearance particularly well. It speaks of the Phalanx as having the look of a giant mace head, with great spires reaching toward the stars from a central mass. The fist symbol, emblazoned on its prow, the clenched gauntlet of the Imperial fists, and is described as being taller than the length of most Imperial spacecraft. Let that sink in. The chapter emblem painted on the front of this ship is larger than most other ships in the Imperial Navy, and the Phalanx shines. Multiple sources describe it as reflecting light like a star, gleaming with a golden luminance that makes it visible across vast distances of space. During the Great Crusade, when the Phalanx appeared in a new system, it was said to serve as a symbol of the coming era of the Imperium itself. A new star had arrived, and in its light, everything would change. But perhaps the most extraordinary detail about the Phalanx's physical nature is this. It has developed its own ecosystem. The vessel is so vast, with so many cavernous internal spaces, that over the millennia, unique species of animal life have evolved within its hull. That the hangar sections are home to flying creatures that have had their own independent evolutionary history aboard the ship, adapting to the specific conditions of those enormous enclosed spaces over thousands of generations. This is not a detail that the lore throws around casually. An artificial structure developing its own independent ecology is something that, in the real world, we associate with proposals for generation ships or space habitats of extraordinary scale. The fact that the Phalanx has achieved this naturally through the simple passage of time tells us more about its true size than any measurement in kilometers ever could. The vessel has been compared in scale to a hive city set adrift in space, and that comparison is more apt than it might initially seem. Like a hive city, the Phalanx is a self-contained civilization. It has its own population beyond the Space Marines who call it home. It has its own industries, its own supply chains, its own social hierarchies. It is not merely a ship that carries warriors from one battlefield to another. It is a world, a small artificial world built for war, but containing within its armored shell everything needed to sustain a chapter of Space Marines and their attendant support structure indefinitely. To put this in perspective, consider the scale of other vessels in the Imperium's fleet. An Imperial battleship, one of the largest classes of warship in the Imperial Navy, is typically between 5 and 8 kilometers in length. These are enormous vessels by any standard, crewed by tens of thousands of personnel, bristling with weapons that can level continents. A single Imperial battleship can dominate the orbital space of an entire world, and a squadron of them represents a concentration of firepower that can reshape the surface of a planet. The Phalanx dwarfs them all. It is not merely bigger than a battleship. It operates on an entirely different scale of existence. When the Phalanx enters a system, battleships do not form up alongside it as escorts. They dock at its foredeck, like small boats tying up at the hull of an ocean liner. The relationship between the Phalanx and ordinary warships is not one of comrades in arms. It is one of vessel and harbor. Even the Ramillies-class star forts, those massive orbital defense platforms that the Imperium uses to anchor its control over critical systems, are overshadowed by the Phalanx. A Ramillies star fort is an impressive structure in its own right, a small city in space bristling with weapons and shields, but it is fundamentally a static defensive installation. The Phalanx is all of that and more, with the added capability of independent warp travel and the offensive armament to match. The only vessels that approach the Phalanx in terms of raw scale are the craft worlds of the Eldari, as those continent-sized wraithbone structures that serve as the wandering homes of the surviving Eldar race. The lore explicitly draws this comparison, noting that the Phalanx is the only vessel ever built by mankind, that comes close in size and complexity to an elder craft world. This is an extraordinary claim, given that craft worlds are essentially artificial worlds, self-sustaining ecosystems, capable of supporting populations numbering in the millions. While the fact that the Phalanx even belongs in the same conversation speaks to the staggering ambition of its long-forgotten builders. There is also the matter of the Phalanx's speed, which is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of its physical characteristics. You would expect a vessel the size of a small moon to be ponderous, slow, almost geological in its movements. You would be wrong. The source material describes the Phalanx as incredibly fast despite its immense bulk. One passage from the novels describes it entering the Sol system at 3/4 the speed of light, its drives flaring like captured stars as it crossed the orbit of Neptune in a flicker of dazzling radiation. At 3/4 light speed, a vessel the mass of a small moon, hurtling through the solar system faster than most Imperial warships can manage at full burn. The kinetic energy alone at that velocity, for an object of that mass, is almost incomprehensible. And the Phalanx warp drive is equally formidable. The great vessel can enter and exit the warp with a violence that sends sheets of exotic lightning radiating outward into the void. When it drops out of warp translation, the event is so energetic that it registers on sensitive instruments across an entire star system. Delicate sensory devices on nearby planets detect the Phalanx arrival and immediately communicate reports to relay stations, which in turn transmit the news onward by astropath to Terra. The arrival of the Phalanx is not something that goes unnoticed. It is a galactic event. When the novel Flight of the Eisenstein describes Nathaniel Garrow exploring the Phalanx for the first time, the Death Guard battle captain walks through corridors that feel ancient and lived in, through galleries of battle honors that stretch for kilometers, through sections that replicate different combat environments for training purposes. He visits a vast chamber that replicates the Inwitian frost dunes where legend says Dorn grew to manhood. All around him, warriors in golden armor move with sober intent, and the marble and green of his own Death Guard war gear feels out of place among the hornet yellow and black trim of the Imperial fists. This is one of the things that makes the Phalanx so fascinating as a piece of lore. It is not just a weapon platform, though it is certainly that. It is a home. A place where generations of Imperial fists have trained and prayed and prepared for war. A place where the chapter's most sacred relics are kept, where its history is preserved in stone and steel and stained glass, where the very walls whisper with 10,000 years of devotion to a golden ideal that most of the galaxy has long since forgotten. Let us step inside and walk its halls. The interior of the Phalanx is a study in contradictions. It is a warship, bristling with enough firepower to annihilate battle fleets, but its corridors are decorated with the aesthetic sensibility of a cathedral. Stone archways frame passages wide enough for an armored space marine to walk comfortably. Vaulted ceilings soar overhead, decorated with frescoes depicting the victories of the Imperial fists across 10 millennia of warfare. Cathedral elements are woven throughout the architecture, are mixing the sacred with the martial in a way that reflects the Imperial fists' dual identity as warriors and wardens of the Emperor's legacy. The nerve center of the Phalanx is the Strategium, which serves as both the command bridge of the vessel itself and the headquarters of the entire Imperial fists fleet. The bridge is arranged like an amphitheater, with multiple concentric rings of consoles surrounding a massive holographic projector at the center. Yet these rings are arranged on increasingly higher levels as they move outward from the center, giving the entire space a sense of depth and hierarchy. The holographic projector can display multiple diagrams and images simultaneously, some of them reaching up to 4 stories in height, creating a living, breathing tactical display that allows the commander to take in the state of an entire war zone at a glance. On one side of the bridge sits Dorn's personal command room, positioned high enough to overlook the entire Strategium. It is enclosed by a glass dome that appears to be supported by the statues of massive space marines, and iron panels can be deployed to provide privacy when needed. From inside the dome, the commander can access any console on the bridge below, monitoring every aspect of the vessel's operations from a position of elevated authority. But the Strategium is more than just a bridge. It houses the single most sacred relic of the Imperial Fists chapter, the Hand of Dorn. This is believed to be the last remaining portion of the body of Rogal Dorn himself, the Primarch's severed hand, preserved and enshrined within the command center of the vessel he once captained. Every Imperial Fist, from the newest initiate to the most grizzled veteran, renews his oaths of service before this relic. The bones of each finger and each segment bear inscriptions, are the names of chapter masters who have served across the centuries. The left hand's first metacarpal, for example, carries the names of chapter masters Bronwyn Abermort, Maximus Thane, Kalman Flodensbog, and many others. The first phalanx of the thumb bears the name Ambrosian Spectre. Whether the hand truly belonged to Rogal Dorn, or whether his remains lie elsewhere, is a question that the lore deliberately leaves unresolved. And it is even possible that Dorn survived the assault upon the Chaos Warship Sword of Sacrilege where he is believed to have fallen, and that his fate remains unknown. But for the Imperial Fists, the truth of the relic matters less than its symbolic power. The Hand of Dorn serves as a reminder of sacrifice and commitment, a physical connection to the Primarch who founded their chapter and defined its character. So it is that throughout the chapter's history, from the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium to the 13th Black Crusade, the Imperial Fists have drawn inspiration from their Primarch's remains and resolved to defeat their foes or die in the attempt. Deeper within the Phalanx, past the operational sections and the garrison quarters, lie the vessel's spiritual heart, or rather, its spiritual hearts, because the Phalanx has several sacred spaces, each serving a different function in the chapter's complex ritual life. While the Temple of Oaths is the most ancient and most revered of these spaces. Located deep inside the Star Fortress, it was once the spiritual center of the entire 7th Legion. Rogal Dorn himself consecrated the Temple of Oaths shortly after the year 835 of the 30th Millennium, establishing it as the place where every member of the Legion would swear fealty to him and to the Imperium. The temple was no shrine to superstitious religion. During the Great Crusade, the Imperium operated under the Imperial Truth, a secular philosophy that rejected the existence of gods and the power of faith. The Temple of Oaths was instead dedicated to the humanist ideals of the Crusade, to the sacrifices those ideals demanded, and to the oaths that bound every Imperial Fist to their Primarch and their Emperor. Beneath the tattered and burned banners of defeated enemies, and before the statues of dead heroes of the Legion, the Imperial Fists would return again and again to renew their perpetual oaths of loyalty. Each oath made by a son of Dorn was carved into the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, etched for eternity in black granite. Over the decades and centuries, those carvings multiplied until the entire interior of the temple was covered in a dense, overlapping record of 10,000 promises made and 10,000 promises kept. The first company of the Imperial Fists was given the honor of guarding the Temple of Oaths, and these warriors became known as the Templar Brethren. They were the most elite soldiers in the entire Legion, armed with the finest war gear the armories of the 7th could provide, and their duty was considered the highest honor a son of Dorn could receive. The first captain held the title of Guardian of the Oaths of every Imperial Fists warrior, as a position that commanded not just authority, but the profound respect of every battle brother. During the final years of the Great Crusade and throughout the Horus Heresy, that warrior was First Captain Sigismund, who would later become the founding High Marshal of the Black Templars, one of the most zealous and feared successor chapters in the entire Imperium. Today, however, the Temple of Oaths is sealed. The men who were once permitted to walk its halls without leave from Dorn are long dead, as their names remembered only in the chapter's archives. The temple has become a place of memory rather than worship, its granite walls still bearing the carved oaths of warriors who fell in battles that occurred millennia ago. No living Imperial Fist has entered its chambers in thousands of years, and the chapter has made no move to unseal it. Some things, it seems, are meant to remain undisturbed. In place of the Temple of Oaths, the Imperial Fists now use the Cloister of Remembrance, at a more recent shrine that serves as the closest current equivalent to the ancient temple. It is here that captured trophies and battle honors are kept, where the chapter's victories are commemorated and its losses mourned. The captains of the chapter renew their oaths in this space, maintaining the ancient tradition in a newer setting. Unlike the Temple of Oaths, which was reportedly decorated with the accumulated grandeur of a legion's worth of devotion, as the cloister is described as unfurnished and austere. This is fitting for the Imperial Fists, a chapter that has always valued substance over show, duty over glory, and the cold satisfaction of a task completed over the warm glow of public recognition. The Hall Mortalis serves a very different function. This is where the chapter's aspirant recruits are gathered and trained, but where the young men drawn from the Imperial Fists' various recruiting worlds are first introduced to the reality of what they are about to become. The Phalanx, remember, is the chapter's sole fortress monastery. Unlike chapters that maintain a fixed homeworld with training facilities and recruitment infrastructure, the Imperial Fists do everything aboard their great vessel. Scouts are trained here. Initiates undergo the agonizing process of surgical enhancement here, as the rituals of transformation that turn a mortal human into a transhuman warrior of the Adeptus Astartes all take place within the armored hull of the Phalanx. One of the most distinctive of these rituals is the Pain Glove, a device unique to the Imperial Fists that has become one of their most recognizable cultural markers. The Pain Glove is exactly what it sounds like, a device that encases the wearer and subjects them to excruciating agony. It serves dual purposes. First, as a test of endurance. An aspirant who cannot withstand the Pain Glove's torments is deemed unfit for service. Second, and more importantly, as a tool for mental clarity. The Imperial Fists believe that pain strips away illusion, that in the crucible of suffering, all pretense and self-deception burns away, leaving only the truth of who you are and what you are capable of. Many Imperial Fists continue to use the Pain Glove throughout their careers, submitting themselves to its embrace before important decisions or after significant failures, using the agony as a kind of meditation. The observatory is another notable space within the Phalanx, though it serves a more practical function. It is a viewing dome built as a throne room for past chapter masters, where the transparent dome affords a dramatic enough view of space to intimidate the chapter's guests. Visiting dignitaries, planetary governors seeking military aid, representatives of other imperial institutions, all would be brought to the observatory and confronted with the raw majesty of the void itself, framed by the immense bulk of the Phalanx stretching away in all directions. It was a calculated show of power, a reminder that the man seated beneath that dome commanded not just a chapter of superhuman warriors, but the most powerful starship in the Imperium. And then there is the Librarium, and a vast repository of accumulated knowledge dating back to the distant era of the Great Crusade. The Phalanx has served as the Imperial Fist's home for more than 10,000 years, and in that time, the chapter's librarians have collected and preserved an astonishing volume of information. Tactical analyses from campaigns fought across the breadth of the galaxy, treatises on siege warfare written by Dorn himself, records of encounters with alien species, heretical cults, and demonic incursions. The Librarium of the Phalanx is one of the most comprehensive military archives in the entire Imperium, a treasure trove of knowledge that the chapter guards with the same ferocity it brings to every other aspect of its existence. Beyond these named locations, the Phalanx contains countless other spaces that reflect the chapter's 10,000-year history. Training halls, where companies of space marines drill in every conceivable combat environment. Armories stocked with the tools of war, from the humble bolt pistol to exotic relics of the Great Crusade. Medity facilities where the chapter's apothecaries tend to the wounded and harvest the precious gene seed of the fallen. Chapel shrines where battle brothers kneel in prayer before the Emperor's likeness, seeking strength for the wars to come. all of it contained within a vessel so vast that entire sections have fallen into disuse and decay, and too far from the chapter's active areas to be maintained by a force of merely 1,000 Space Marines. Now, a fortress of this magnitude requires defenders, and the Phalanx has been protected by some of the most formidable warriors to ever serve the Emperor across its long history. During the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, the defense of the Phalanx fell to a specialized formation known as the Phalanx Warders. These were not ordinary Space Marines, not by any stretch of the imagination. Selected from the ranks of the Imperial Fist's Breacher siege squads, the Phalanx Warders were a reinforced company, specifically trained and equipped for the unique challenges of defending the great vessel from boarding assault. Their fighting style was as distinctive as their duty. Each warder carried a massive slab-like boarding shield, forged from the same materials that armored the Phalanx itself. In battle, they would form interlocking shield walls across the vessel's corridors and choke points, presenting an impenetrable barrier of ceramite to any attacker foolish enough to attempt a breach. Behind those shields, the warders carried an arsenal of close-range weapons, power axes and thunderhammers and breacher charges designed to devastate enemy formations at arm's length. The warders were renowned for their particularly harsh discipline, even by the already exacting standards of the Imperial Fists. They displayed few battle honors and practiced no rituals to mark achievement. For them, the honor of continuing their service was the only distinction they required. They were stark, grim, and utterly dedicated to their singular purpose. Guard the Phalanx, repel all boarders, die at your post if necessary, but never, ever yield a single corridor. Beyond their defensive role, warder detachments were often seconded to other companies of the Imperial Fists, lending their considerable expertise to boarding actions and close-quarters engagements across the galaxy. They were as lethal on the offensive as they were immovable on the defense, trained to punch through enemy ship defenses with the same brutal efficiency they used to hold their own. As we mentioned, the first company of the Imperial Fists held a separate but equally prestigious duty. The Templar Brethren, and as they were known, served as the guardians of the Temple of Oaths. These were the Legion's finest warriors, armed with the best war gear the armories could provide, including archaeotech weapons from the Dark Age of technology, the newest creations of the Mechanicum, and more common marks of weapons forged with exacting precision. Their black artificer armor, marked only with yellow on the shoulder plates and shields, made them visually distinctive from their brothers. And their martial prowess was unmatched within the Legion. The relationship between the Warders and the Templars was complementary. The Warders held the physical defenses of the Phalanx. The Templars guarded its spiritual heart. Together, they formed a two-layered defense that protected not just the vessel's hull and systems, but the very soul of the Imperial Fists. In the modern era of the 41st Millennium, the defense of the Phalanx is entrusted to a different but no less dedicated force.
Now, before we get into the fall of Cadia, I just want to take a quick second here to share something personal. The Phalanx is honestly one of my favorite pieces of lore in the entire setting. And I think the reason it hits so hard for me is that it's not just a cool ship. It's a story about holding onto something precious while the world falls apart around you. The Imperial Fists know they can't fix the Phalanx. They know it's dying by degrees, and they choose to maintain it anyway, day after day, century after century, because the alternative is giving up, and that to me is the most human thing in a setting full of superhuman warriors. It is stubbornness dressed up as devotion, and I think we all relate to that on some level. But anyways, let's continue the video.
The Auric Auxilia are the Phalanx's standing garrison, a special security force that handles the day-to-day defense of the vessel and maintains order among its non-Astartes population. For most of the chapter's history, the Auxilia's ranks were filled by those Imperial Fists aspirants who failed the chapter's grueling selection process. These were men who had demonstrated the courage and determination to attempt the transformation into a Space Marine, but whose bodies or minds had ultimately proved unequal to the task. Rather than being discarded, they were given the honor of defending the chapter's home, a duty they took to with fierce pride. The composition of the Auric Auxilia changed significantly in the wake of the 13th Black Crusade and the destruction of the fortress world Cadia. After the Phalanx led the evacuation fleet that carried the surviving defenders of Cadia to safety, thousands of displaced Cadian soldiers volunteered to serve aboard the great vessel. These were some of the finest soldiers in the entire Imperium, veterans of a world that had stood as the first line of defense against chaos for 10,000 years. Their gratitude for the Imperial Fist's role in saving them from annihilation was profound, and Chapter Master Gregor Decian, the Imperial Fist's latest commander, ordered the auxiliars' ranks to expand to accommodate them. The inclusion of Cadian veterans transformed the auxilia from a relatively small security force into a substantial military formation. The current commander is reported to be a female Cadian officer, Colonel Talia Karsk, a detail that speaks to the pragmatic nature of the arrangement. The Cadians brought their own military culture, their own expertise, and their own traditions to the Phalanx, as enriching the vessel's already complex social fabric. It is worth noting that the Codex Astartes technically prohibits Space Marine chapters from maintaining large auxiliary forces, but the Phalanx is an exception. Its sheer size and strategic importance demand a standing army far larger than any single chapter could provide from its own ranks alone. Beyond the auxilia, the Phalanx is also home to a contingent of Adeptus Custodes, the golden warriors of the Emperor's own bodyguard. The circumstances of their presence aboard the vessel are interesting. Following the repair and restoration of the Phalanx during the Indomitus Crusade, the Imperial Fists begrudgingly accepted a visible contingent of custodians on board, part of the arrangement by which the Custodes provided the ancient technology needed to restore the vessel's failing systems. But the Imperial Fists suspect, not without reason, that additional custodians had already slipped aboard the Phalanx before the formal arrangement was made, embedding themselves covertly within the vessel's labyrinthine interior. The reason for this covert presence is practical, if somewhat unsettling. The Custodes, ever mindful of their duty to protect the Emperor and Terra above all other considerations, have stationed themselves aboard the Phalanx as a contingency measure. Should the great vessel ever be turned against Terra, or should it fall into the hands of traitors or be corrupted by the forces of chaos, the custodians embedded within its hull stand ready to sabotage it from within. It is a cold calculation, but a necessary one. The Phalanx is the most powerful warship in the Imperium, and the consequences of it being used against humanity's homeworld are too terrible to contemplate. With that understanding of the vessel's physical reality, its interior, and its defenders, let us turn to the Phalanx's role during what many consider the golden age of the Imperium, the Great Crusade. When Rogal Dorn took command of the 7th Legion and married them to the Phalanx, the effect was transformative. The Imperial Fists had always been a disciplined and effective fighting force, but with the Phalanx as their base of operations, they became something more. They became a strategic reserve of unparalleled mobility and striking power. As the Phalanx could carry an entire legion of Space Marines across the galaxy, deploying them with devastating speed to wherever the Emperor needed them most. While other legions were tied to specific theaters of operation, the Imperial Fists aboard the Phalanx could respond to crises across the entire span of the Crusade's front. Few integrations of Primarch and Legion were as swift or as complete as that between Rogal Dorn and the Imperial Fists. The ideals of the Imperium and the purpose of the Great Crusade fit perfectly with Dorn's outlook and drive. The warriors of the 7th Legion were exemplars of everything he had built in the Inwit cluster, and everything he had dreamed of for its future. From the first moment Dorn met his Gene Sons, he demanded of them everything he would ask of himself. When he met Legion Master Matthias and veteran contingents of the Imperial Fists, he is said to have maintained complete silence, as speaking to no one, even after they knelt and pledged their fealty. Only after he had observed them in battle did he break his silence. He told them that they had much to do and more to learn. To Matthias, he gave a single word of thanks and named him High Castellan of the Inwit cluster. Over the next 16 decades, the Imperial Fists fought on the burning edge of the Great Crusade, pushing relentlessly from war zone to war zone, so that they were honored by each of their brother legions and rose high in the estimation of many. The Phalanx was at the heart of every campaign, its shadow falling across world after world as the Imperial fists brought compliance and order to humanity's scattered colonies. The Legion accumulated a record second only to that of the Lunar Wolves, Horus's own legion, and the battle honors that filled the Phalanx's galleries stretched for kilometers. The Emperor himself is recorded as having traveled often aboard the Phalanx during the Great Crusade. This is a significant detail because it speaks to the trust the Emperor placed in Dorn and the reverence he held for the vessel. The Phalanx served, in a very real sense, as the Emperor's own mobile court during certain phases of the Crusade, a floating palace from which the Master of Mankind directed the expansion of his Imperium. Dorn's famous quote captures the chapter's philosophy during this period perfectly. "I want recruits, not vassals." While other Primarchs, such as the increasingly mercurial Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, took every opportunity to garrison conquered worlds and claim their tithes, Dorn asked for nothing but the right to recruit from the populations the Imperial fists had liberated. A fortress chapel would be consecrated on each recruiting world. But the Imperial fists were there as esteemed guests, not masters. The chapter had no homeworld to govern, no political responsibilities to distract from its military purpose. It had the Phalanx, and the Phalanx was enough. One notable example of the Imperial fists' approach to recruitment occurred on Necromunda, the famous hive world that would later become one of the Imperium's most important industrial centers. The Imperial fists won a major victory against the orcs on the ash wastes of that world, and the grateful hive lords consented to having recruits drawn from their population. A fortress chapel was consecrated, but the Imperial fists maintained no permanent presence, no political authority, no claim to the world's resources. They came, they fought, they took what they needed to continue fighting, and they left. Clean, simple, efficient, very Rogal Dorn. It was during the later stages of the Great Crusade that the Imperial fists received what would become their most important assignment. The Emperor, having decided to return to Terra to work on a secret project, the construction of the Webway Gate beneath the Imperial Palace, recalled Dorn and the entire Imperial Fists Legion to the throne world. He appointed Dorn as his castellan, charging him with the responsibility of turning the Imperial Palace into an incomparable fortress. Dorn threw himself into the task with characteristic thoroughness, transforming the already impressive palace complex into a defensive position of staggering depth and complexity. When War Master Horus would eventually arrive at the gates of Terra, he would find them guarded by the finest fortifications that the greatest fortress builder in human history could construct. The irony was not lost on Dorn. He had spent his entire career building fortresses that would protect others. And now he was being asked to build the greatest fortress of all, one that would protect the Emperor himself. It was the ultimate expression of everything he was, everything the Imperial fists represented: duty, service, protection. The walls of the Imperial Palace became Dorn's masterwork, a defensive network of such depth and sophistication that military historians across the Imperium would study it for the next 10,000 years. But the assignment also brought with it the first stirrings of the rivalry that would define the Imperial fists for millennia to come. When the Emperor's children, Primarch Fulgrim, asked Dorn whether the Imperial Palace could withstand an assault by the Iron Warriors, the Fourth Legion, Dorn gave the answer that he always gave: the truth. He said yes. The palace, as he had built it, could withstand the Iron Warriors. Perturabo, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors, was furious. The rivalry between the two siege specialists, one who built fortresses and one who tore them down, had always been intense, but Dorn's honest assessment of his own work pushed Perturabo past the breaking point. The Lord of Iron saw it as arrogance, as a deliberate insult to his legion's capabilities. In truth, it was simply Dorn being Dorn. He could not lie. He had assessed the situation, considered the variables, and stated his conclusion. The fact that his conclusion was deeply offensive to one of his brothers was, from Dorn's perspective, simply unfortunate. This moment would have consequences that echoed across the millennia, The bitter hatred between the Imperial fists and the Iron Warriors would survive the heresy, survive the breaking of the legions, survive 10,000 years of separation and enmity. It would manifest again and again in the history of the Phalanx, most dramatically in the assault by warsmith Shontu that we will discuss shortly. During this period, the Phalanx took up a position in orbit over Terra, serving as Dorn's command base, while he oversaw the construction of the palace defenses. The great vessel became a fixture of Terra's sky, its golden bulk visible from the surface like a new star, a constant reminder to the population below that the Emperor's Praetorian stood watch over them. The Phalanx also served a more practical function during this time. Its vast training facilities were used to prepare the Imperial fists for the kind of warfare that Dorn anticipated was coming. While other legions trained for open battle, for lightning strikes and swift advances, Dorn drilled his sons in the art of defense. Siege warfare, close quarters combat, the grinding, attritional fighting that happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. He understood, too, with the prescience that seemed to characterize many of the Primarchs, that the war he was preparing for would not be won by dashing cavalry charges or brilliant flanking maneuvers. It would be won in the trenches, on the walls, in the grinding, bloody, inch-by-inch fighting that defined siege warfare at its most brutal. The Emperor himself continued to use the Phalanx during this period, though his visits became less frequent as his work on the Webway project consumed more and more of his attention. The ancient records suggest that the Emperor traveled often aboard the Phalanx during the Great Crusade, and those journeys represented some of the last moments of normalcy, if such a word can ever be applied to the Emperor of mankind, before the galaxy descended into the madness of civil war. And then came the heresy, and everything changed. The Horus Heresy, that galaxy-spanning civil war that tore the Imperium apart and nearly destroyed everything the Emperor had built, is the defining catastrophe of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. When War Master Horus turned against his father and led fully half of the Space Marine legions into rebellion, the consequences were felt on every world in the Imperium. Trusted brothers became mortal enemies, allies became traitors, and the dream of a united humanity crumbled to ash in the fires of fratricidal war. And for the Phalanx, the heresy brought both its greatest trial and its closest brush with destruction. But before we get to the darkest hours, there is a moment worth savoring. A moment when the Phalanx served as the stage for one of the most pivotal scenes in the entire heresy narrative: the arrival of the Eisenstein. The frigate Eisenstein, a battered Death Guard vessel crewed by loyalists who had escaped the massacre at Istvan III, or limped into the outer reaches of the Sol system, carrying the first warning of Horus's betrayal. The ship was damaged, its crew exhausted, its captain, Nathaniel Garrow, carrying a message so terrible that he could barely bring himself to believe it, let alone speak it aloud. It was the Phalanx that found the Eisenstein. The great star fortress dispatched sensor arrays and patrol ships to investigate the unknown vessel, and what they found was a frigate covered in the scars of battle, armor drifting through the void like a wounded animal. The Phalanx systems catalogued the damage, the weapon signatures that had been carved into the Eisenstein's hull. Imperial weapons. The Eisenstein had been shot at by its own fleet. Garrow was brought aboard the Phalanx and taken before Rogal Dorn himself. The scene that followed was one of the most emotionally charged moments in the heresy novels. Garrow, a proud warrior of the Death Guard, knelt before the golden Primarch of the Imperial Fists and told him that his brother Horus had turned traitor, that the War Master of the Imperium, the Emperor's most trusted son, had declared war on his own father, that entire legions of Space Marines had abandoned their oaths and taken up arms against the Imperium they had sworn to protect. Dorn's reaction was explosive. He accused Garrow of slander. He nearly killed the messenger. It was only the intervention of other loyalists aboard the Eisenstein, including the Remembrancer, Masadi Ollerton, whose fate would later become so tragically intertwined with the Phalanx's own, that stayed the Primarch's hand long enough for the evidence to be presented and the terrible truth to be accepted. After the Eisenstein delivered its warning and the reality of the heresy had been absorbed, Dorn ordered the battered frigate destroyed. The Phalanx fired 4 torpedoes armed with nuclear warheads, reducing the Eisenstein to atoms. The contamination from warp exposure was simply too great to risk salvaging the vessel. It was a mercy killing, in a sense, and a harbinger of the destruction to come. For much of the heresy, the Phalanx remained stationed over Terra, serving as Dorn's command base, while he coordinated the defense of the Sol system against the approaching traitor forces. As the great vessel was a crucial component of Terra's orbital defenses, its weapons and sensor arrays supplementing the already formidable defenses that Dorn had built around the throne world. But as Horus's advance drew near and the traitor forces closed in for what would become the siege of Terra, Dorn made the decision to move his personal command from the Phalanx to the Pab Bastion within the Imperial Palace itself. The defense of Terra would be conducted from the ground, from the very walls that Dorn had built with such painstaking care. Before the siege began in earnest, however, the Phalanx played a crucial role in the Battle of Pluto, one of the key engagements of the Solar War. The Alpha Legion, the 20th Legion, had infiltrated the outer defenses of the Sol system, seizing the fortress moon of Kerberos and using its heavy weapons to rain deadly fire upon the loyalist positions on Charon, Nyx and Styx. The situation was dire. Dorn's carefully constructed defensive network was being turned against him by an enemy that had once shared its secrets. Archamus, Rogal Dorn's master of the Huskars and one of his most trusted warriors, was able to deduce the Alpha Legion's true objective, the sabotage of the Imperial astropathic monitoring network centered on the moon Hydra. A Huskar contingent was dispatched to stop them, but the engagement went badly. The Alpha Legion's Primarch, Alpharius himself, was leading the assault, and his elite Lernaean Terminators were more than a match for the loyalist defenders. Archamus was left mortally wounded, and all seemed lost. And then the Phalanx arrived. The great Star Fortress, led by Rogal Dorn himself, burst into the combat zone with a massive Imperial Fists fleet in tow. Using the competing gravity wells throughout the Sol system, the fleet had slingshotted itself toward Pluto at astonishing speed, arriving faster than any defender or attacker had thought possible. The Imperial Fists immediately pacified the captured guns on Kerberos, reclaiming the fortress moon from the Alpha Legion's control. Dorn personally led his Huskars in a teleport assault upon the astropathic chamber on Hydra, materializing inside the locked facility where Alpharius was directing the sabotage. What followed was an epic duel between two Primarchs, brothers turned enemies by the madness of the heresy. Dorn and Alpharius clashed in the confined spaces of the astropathic chamber, their weapons ringing against each other with the force of colliding tanks. When Alpharius was about to deliver a killing blow with his pale spear, the dying Archamus intervened, distracting the Alpha Legion Primarch just long enough for Dorn to turn the tide. The exact outcome of the duel is a matter of some dispute in the lore, as is so often the case with anything involving the Alpha Legion. But what matters for our purposes is the role the Phalanx played in the engagement. Without the Star Fortress and its fleet, the outer defenses of the Sol system would have fallen. The Alpha Legion would have blinded the Imperium's astropathic network, cutting off Terra from the rest of the loyal forces at the most critical moment in the war. The Phalanx's arrival, timed perfectly and executed with devastating precision, preserved the defensive network that Dorn had spent years building. During the final stages of the Solar War, the brutal void engagements that preceded the siege of Terra proper, Dorn conceived an even more audacious plan. He intended to use the Phalanx to shatter the traitor armada as it emerged near Luna and Mars. The great vessel would lead a devastating counterattack, using its overwhelming firepower to break the back of the traitor fleet before it could establish a foothold in the inner system. Dorn personally took command of the Phalanx for this operation, standing on the same bridge where he had first met his father all those decades ago. But the operation went horribly wrong, and from an entirely unexpected direction. A human woman named Mercedes Ollerton, a remembrancer who had been traveling with the Imperial forces, unwittingly became the vector for a demonic incursion. The demon Samus, a malevolent entity of terrible power, used Olaton as a conduit to open a portal into the warp directly aboard the Phalanx. Within moments, the great vessel was flooded with demonic entities, creatures of nightmare and madness, that poured through the breach and began slaughtering everyone they encountered. The battle that followed was one of the most desperate in the Phalanx's long history. Dorn and his Imperial fists fought through corridors that had become hellscapes, every bulkhead and junction point contested by demon and loyalist alike. The situation deteriorated so rapidly that Dorn was forced to contemplate the unthinkable. Destroying the Phalanx, scuttling the greatest warship in the Imperium rather than allowing it to fall into the hands of the warp. He prepared to give the order to sacrifice 10,000 years of history and the irreplaceable technologies of the Dark Age of technology to prevent the demons from claiming the vessel. It was Olaton herself who saved the Phalanx. The Remembrancer, understanding that she was the bridge through which the demons were entering the material world, but made the ultimate sacrifice. She took her own life, and in doing so, closed the portal she had unintentionally created. The demons were banished, hurled back through the rift into the Imperium from which they had come. The Phalanx was saved, but it had been badly damaged in the fighting. With the traitor forces closing in to begin the Siege of Terror, Dorn knew that the Phalanx could not remain in orbit over the throne world. It was too damaged to serve as an effective defensive platform, and its loss would be a devastating blow to Imperial morale. Instead, Dorn ordered Admiral Neora Sukasson of the Armada Imperialis to take the Phalanx into the outer reaches of the Sol system. There, it would be preserved from destruction while simultaneously waging a guerrilla war against the rear echelons of the traitor Armada. The Phalanx spent the remainder of the Siege of Terror lurking near the orbit of Saturn with the remnants of the Loyalist fleet, striking at traitor supply lines and harassing their forces from the fringes of the system. This was not an accident or a strategic mistake, but a deliberate decision by Dorn. If the Imperial Palace fell, if the unthinkable happened and the Emperor was killed, the Phalanx would be the last hope. The only vessel in the Imperium capable of breaking through the traitor fleet's Siege of Terror and attempting a rescue, or at the very least, a last stand worthy of the 7th Legion's legacy. Whilst in the end, the palace did not fall. The Emperor confronted Horus aboard his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, and though the Master of Mankind was mortally wounded in the process, Horus was destroyed, and the traitor forces broken. Dorn himself was part of the boarding party that teleported onto the Vengeful Spirit, though he was separated from the Emperor and Sanguinius during the assault by the corrupting influence of chaos. He arrived too late to change the outcome, finding only the broken bodies of his father and his brother. After the heresy, the Phalanx returned to its vigil over Terror. The war was over, but the scars would never fully heal, not for the Imperium, and not for the great vessel that had served it through the worst crisis in human history. During the Siege of Terror itself, when Horus's forces battered against the walls of the Imperial Palace, in some of the most apocalyptic fighting the galaxy had ever seen, just the Phalanx had been unable to participate directly. Sent to the outer system on Dorn's orders, it lurked near Saturn with the remnants of the Loyalist fleet, a reserve force held back against the worst possible outcome. The Imperial fists who remained aboard the Phalanx during the siege must have endured an agony of frustration, knowing that their brothers were fighting and dying on Terra's walls while they waited in the cold dark between the outer planets. But Dorn's reasoning was sound, even if it was painful. The Phalanx was too important to lose. If the palace fell, if Horus won, the Phalanx would be the last rallying point for Loyalist forces. It would be the vessel from which a counterattack could be launched, or failing that, the ship that could carry the survivors of Terra's garrison to safety, preserving the gene seed and the traditions of the Imperial fists for whatever dark future lay ahead. In a war defined by passion and fury, Dorn's decision to hold the Phalanx in reserve was an act of cold, calculating pragmatism. It was the kind of decision that only a man who could never lie to himself would make. When the war ended and the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne, Dorn fell into a grief so profound that it nearly consumed him. He blamed himself for the Emperor's wounds, for the deaths of his brothers Sanguinius and the others who had fallen during the siege. Like the man who had built the greatest fortress in human history felt that his walls had failed, that his defenses had been insufficient, that if he had been stronger, smarter, better, the outcome might have been different. This guilt manifested in a number of ways. The most significant, from the perspective of the Phalanx's history, was the Iron Cage incident. Dorn, driven by a combination of grief and a desperate need to prove that his will remained unbroken, led the Imperial fists into a trap set by his bitter rival Perturabo of the Iron Warriors. The resulting battle, fought across the nightmarish killing ground of Perturabo's Iron Cage, was a bloodbath that nearly destroyed the Imperial fists as a fighting force. The Legion was only saved by the intervention of Rabute Guilliman's Ultramarines, and in the aftermath, Dorn was forced to accept the division of his Legion into smaller chapters, as prescribed by Guilliman's Codex Astartes. The breaking of the Legion had profound implications for the Phalanx. The great vessel, designed to house 100,000 warriors, was now the home of a single chapter of roughly 1,000 Space Marines. The successor chapters that had been carved from the Imperial Fists, the Black Templars, the Crimson Fists, the Fists Exemplar, and others, each went their own way, taking with them the warriors, the traditions, and the institutional knowledge that had once filled the Phalanx's halls. First Captain Sigismund, the greatest warrior of the 7th Legion and the guardian of the Temple of Oaths, was given command of the Black Templars and the flagship Eternal Crusader. He left the Phalanx to pursue his own eternal crusade against the enemies of the Emperor, and the temple he had guarded was sealed behind him, never to be opened again. The Phalanx, once teeming with the life and purpose of a full legion, became a hollow thing. Beautiful, powerful, but fundamentally empty, as a cathedral with too few worshippers, a fortress with too few defenders. The golden light still shone from its hull, but it shone over corridors that no one walked and chambers that no one used. The millennia that followed the heresy were a long, slow decline for the Phalanx, a decline that mirrored the broader decay of the Imperium itself. The problem was fundamental and, in hindsight, obvious. The Phalanx had been built to sustain a full Space Marine Legion. During the Great Crusade, as the Imperial Fists numbered approximately 100,000 warriors, plus their human support staff, their fleet assets, and their vast logistical apparatus, the Phalanx had been designed to house all of it, to serve as the beating heart of a military force larger than some planetary armies. After the heresy, when Rabute Guilliman's Codex Astartes reformed the Space Marine legions into smaller, more manageable chapters of roughly 1,000 warriors each, the Phalanx suddenly found itself absurdly oversized for its new occupants. Most of its vast docking bays were deserted. Entire sections fell into disuse, their lights going dark, their systems cycling down to standby mode, their corridors echoing with the footsteps of ghosts. The Imperial Fists, now numbering barely 1,000 strong, rattled around inside the Phalanx like a handful of seeds in a drum. Worse still, the Imperium's inability to replicate the ancient technologies that had gone into the Phalanx's construction meant that even minor damage created significant operational problems. When a system failed, the tech marines assigned to maintain the vessel often lacked the knowledge or the materials to repair it. They could keep existing systems running through a combination of expertise, prayer to the machine spirits, and the application of increasingly desperate jury rigging, but they could not restore what was lost. Each year, a little more of the Phalanx's original capabilities slipped away, like sand running through an hourglass that could never be turned over. By the mid-32nd millennium, roughly 1,500 years after the end of the heresy, the Phalanx was already in a state of noticeable decay. It was still operational, still formidable, still the most powerful warship in the Imperium by a considerable margin, but it was a shadow of what it had been, a pale echo of the vessel that had carried 100,000 warriors across the stars during the Great Crusade. It was in this state that the Phalanx faced the greatest Orc invasion since the Black Crusade. The War of the Beast, as it came to be known, erupted in 544 of the 32nd Millennium, when an Orc warlord of unprecedented power and cunning, known only as the Beast, launched a massive assault on the Imperium. The Orcs of this invasion were unlike anything the Imperium had encountered before. They were larger, smarter, and better equipped than any greenskin horde in living memory, and they commanded weapons of terrifying sophistication, including vast, planetoid-sized constructs called attack moons that could materialize in orbit above a world and devastate it with gravity weapons of unstoppable power. The Imperial fists were among the first to encounter the Beast's forces, and they paid a terrible price. On the world of Ardamantua, the chapter was ambushed by an attack moon that materialized in orbit without warning. The resulting engagement was catastrophic. The Imperial Fist's fleet was shattered, and the chapter itself was nearly annihilated. Chapter Master Cassius Mirhen fell in battle, and the survivors were hunted through the ruins of a dying world. Only one Imperial Fist escaped the destruction, a single warrior named Corland, yet who would later take the mantle of Chapter Master and lead the Imperium's response to the Beast's invasion. During this crisis, the Phalanx was deemed too valuable to risk in direct combat against the attack moons. The great vessel was moved to a position between Terra and Venus, held in reserve against the possibility that the Beast's forces might strike at the throne world itself. This decision speaks volumes about the Phalanx state at the time, in its prime, and the Phalanx would have been a devastating weapon against any enemy, including the Orc attack moons. But in its diminished condition, the risk of losing it in battle was judged too great. The Imperium could not afford to lose its greatest warship, even in the face of an existential threat. The War of the Beast eventually saw the destruction and rebuilding of the Imperial Fists chapter. Corland fell during the second invasion of Ulanor, and with him, as the original bloodline of the Imperial Fists became extinct. They would have remained so if not for the actions of Chapter Master Maximus Thane of the Fists Exemplar, who gathered warriors from each of the Imperial Fists' second founding successor chapters and used them to reconstitute the parent chapter. The reborn Imperial Fists, carrying the gene seed of Rogal Dorn, but drawn from diverse chapter traditions, took up residence on the Phalanx once more. But the Phalanx itself played a role in the final stages of the war. During the last invasion of Ulanor, the great vessel was manned by the 10th Company and 2 demi-companies of Imperial Fists, serving as the space-based element of the Imperial assault on the Beast's capital. While the ground forces fought their way through the ruins of the Orc stronghold of Gorkogrod, the Phalanx engaged the Greenskin fleet in orbit. The fighting was intense, and the Phalanx itself was boarded by Orcs, as savage Greenskins clambering across its hull and forcing their way through breaches in its armor. The defenders repelled the boarders, but the engagement underscored the vessel's vulnerability. In its prime, no Orc raider would have dared approach the Phalanx. In its diminished state, the Greenskins saw it as just another target. A detail from this period that speaks to the Phalanx's grandeur, even in decline, is the description of its interior that appears in the Beast Arises novels. The massive 4-deck atrium where visiting ships dock is described as having a vaulted ceiling over 100 meters high, decorated with the victories of the Legion and Chapter across the millennia. A 30-meter wide diamond sits at the top of the dome. The walls hold beautiful reliefs, and the marble floor is decorated with a mosaic of Imperial Fist imagery. At the far end, a massive staircase leads to a kilometers-long hall containing various trophies of conquest. Adjacent to this trophy hall, there is a corridor that still bears damage from fighting during the War of the Beast itself, scars that were never repaired, left as a reminder of the price the chapter paid during that terrible conflict. There is also a chamber described as being surrounded with plain glass, used for meetings and councils. At its center sits a black, circular table, and a finely crafted statue of a space marine stands watch over the proceedings. The Rin's World Memorial, as an amphitheater of granite inscribed with the names of the Crimson Fists lost during the near destruction of their fortress monastery, occupies another section. Even in decay, The Phalanx was a place of beauty and solemnity, a monument to the sacrifices of 10,000 years. Thane declared that the Fists would no longer remain sentinels on Terra. Instead, they would embark on the Phalanx in a crusade against mankind's enemies, reclaiming the chapter's legacy of aggressive, mobile warfare. On the Phalanx once again sailed the stars, though it did so as an aging warrior, rather than the invincible engine of war it had once been. As the millennia ground onward, the Phalanx continued its slow decline. Each century brought new systems failures, new sections falling dark, new gaps in the vessel's capabilities that could not be filled. The Imperial Fists maintained it as best they could, pouring their considerable engineering expertise into keeping the ancient vessel operational. But the entropy of 10,000 years is a relentless enemy, and even the sons of Dorn could not hold it back forever. And then, on the eve of the 41st millennium's end, the Phalanx faced a threat that nearly destroyed it from within. In 999 of the 41st millennium, as the forces of chaos massed for what would become the 13th Black Crusade, the Phalanx was stationed in the Sol system, standing its ancient vigil over Terra. The great vessel was not operating at full capacity, and it hadn't been for centuries, but it was still formidable, still the most powerful warship available to the Imperium, and its presence in Terra's orbit was a potent symbol of defiance against the gathering darkness. It was at this moment that two of the Imperium's most dangerous enemies launched a surprise assault on the great vessel, the Iron Warrior's warsmith Shontu. As a veteran traitor marine, whose bitter hatred of the Imperial Fists had been sharpened over 10,000 years of exile in the Eye of Terror, had conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity. Working in concert with Belacor, the first demon prince, a being of immense power and ancient malice, Shontu intended to capture the Phalanx and use it as a weapon against Terra itself. And the plan was to outdo Abaddon, the Despoiler's own 13th Black Crusade, by seizing the Imperium's greatest warship and turning its guns on the Imperial Palace. While Abaddon battered at the gates of Cadia, Shontu and Belacor would end the war in a single, devastating stroke. The assault came without warning. Using a warp rift torn open by Shontu's sorcerous arts, demonic hordes and iron warriors boarding parties materialized inside the Phalanx, bypassing its external defenses entirely. The attack caught the vessel's defenders at a severe disadvantage. Most of the Imperial Fists were deployed elsewhere, engaged in the various campaigns that preceded the Black Crusade. The only forces available to resist the invasion were the newly reconstituted Third Company, commanded by Captain Tor Garadon, and roughly 30 Marines from the First Company's Terminator contingent. Garadon was a warrior of exceptional ability and determination, but even he recognized the impossible odds he faced. His inexperienced Third Company, combined with a handful of elite Terminators, was all that stood between the forces of chaos and control of the most powerful warship in the Imperium. The invaders outnumbered them many times over, and they were led by a demon prince whose power was beyond anything the young Marines had ever encountered. What followed was one of the most desperate defensive actions in the chapter's long history. Yet Garadon and his men fought a fighting retreat through the Phalanx corridors, contesting every junction, every bulkhead, every meter of ground with stubborn, blood-soaked ferocity. The Iron Warriors used demonic scrap code, chaos-corrupted computer viruses, to take control of the Phalanx's own systems, turning the vessel's ancient machine spirits against their masters. Automated defenses activated and targeted Imperial Fists. Doors sealed shut, trapping squads in kill zones. All life support systems fluctuated wildly, filling some sections with toxic atmosphere while venting others to the void. Garadon's response was as brutal as it was necessary. He turned the Phalanx's guns on itself. Using the weapons batteries that still responded to Imperial command, Garadon ordered his gunners to blast away the sections of the vessel that had been infected by the Iron Warrior's machine viruses. The Phalanx literally shot off its own corrupted flesh, purging the digital infection by destroying the hardware it had colonized. The cost was staggering. A full 10% of the Phalanx's total mass was destroyed in the process, blasted away into the void in a cascade of explosions that lit up the Sol system like a brief, terrible sunrise. But the purge worked. The Iron Warrior's machine curse was contained, and Garradon's forces could once again rely on the Phalanx's own systems. More importantly, more. Garradon made a critical decision in the heat of battle. He ordered the Phalanx to enter the warp. By taking the great vessel into the Imperium, he removed the threat it posed to Terra. Even if the Chaos forces captured it, they could not use it against the throne world from within the warp. The gamble was enormous. Entering the warp strengthened the demonic forces aboard the vessel, giving Be'lakor and his legions access to the full power of the Imperium. But it also ensured that Terra was safe, and for Garradon, that was all that mattered. The battle continued within the warp-tossed corridors of the Phalanx, growing more desperate with every passing hour. The Imperial fists were pushed back and back, losing ground and warriors at a rate they could not sustain. Be'lakor was able to summon a full warp rift inside the vessel, pouring ever more demons into the fight. The surviving Imperial fists made their last stand in a final redoubt, who were prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. And then the Legion of the Damned arrived. These spectral warriors, their armor wreathed in ghostly flame, their very existence one of the great mysteries of the 41st millennium, materialized en masse throughout the Phalanx. They fought with a terrible fury, matching the demons blow for blow, flame for flame. Their arrival turned the tide at the most critical possible moment, transforming what should have been a last stand into a counterattack. In the end, Terminator Sergeant Furen of the First Company succeeded in slaying Warsmith Shontu in personal combat, while Be'lakor was banished back to the warp by the combined efforts of the Imperial Fists and the Legion of the Damned. The Phalanx was saved, but it was badly wounded, scarred by the fighting, and diminished by the loss of 1/10 of its mass. And the war was not over, not by a long shot. Or with the Legion of the Damned still aboard, their spectral presence suggesting that the Phalanx had yet more to do, Garradon received a distress signal from the fortress world of Cadia. Abaddon the Despoiler had launched his 13th Black Crusade, and Cadia was under siege. Garradon, overruling the objections of his officers, ordered the Phalanx to set course for the Cadian system. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. As the Phalanx emerged from the warp into the Cadian system like a golden thunderbolt, its arrival catching the Chaos fleet completely by surprise. The great vessel plowed through the traitor formations with a recklessness that would have been suicidal for any other ship. Tor Garradon was not interested in skirmishing. He was not interested in measured engagement or tactical caution. He had one objective, and he was going to achieve it or die trying. The target was the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity, Abaddon's personal command platform, and the most devastating weapon in the Chaos arsenal. The Will of Eternity was an ancient alien construct of immense power, capable of unleashing a warp cannon that could scour the life from an entire world. Abaddon intended to use it to destroy Cadia once and for all, eliminating the network of ancient pylons that held the Eye of Terror in check and opening the way for a full Chaos invasion of the Imperium. Garradon drove the Phalanx straight for the Blackstone Fortress, ignoring the swarms of traitor warships that battered themselves against its armored flanks. The Phalanx took hit after hit, its hull breaching in a dozen places, but it kept coming. On the bridge, damage reports and hull breach klaxons blared continuously, but Garradon paid them no attention. His focus was absolute. Inside the Blackstone Fortress, a boarding party of space wolves, led by the Wolf Lord Sven Bloodhowl, had been fighting a desperate guerrilla war since before the Phalanx's arrival. Bloodhowl's warriors had been trapped aboard the Will of Eternity after a bold boarding action, and they had been fighting for survival ever since, harried by the fortress's Chaos defenders at every turn. But they had not been idle. They had been working their way toward a critical objective, at the shield generators that protected the Blackstone Fortress from external attack. As the Phalanx bore down on the Will of Eternity, Bloodhowl and his remaining warriors launched a final suicidal assault on the shield generators. An explosion flared on the Blackstone Fortress's flank, and along the entire lower port quadrant, the shields sputtered and died. That was the moment Garradon had been waiting for. Every operational weapon battery on the Phalanx opened fire simultaneously, focusing their combined fury on the unshielded section of the Blackstone fortress. The barrage was apocalyptic. Lance beams and macro cannons and torpedo salvos slammed into the ancient alien structure with the accumulated rage of a chapter that had spent 10,000 years defending humanity from the darkness. Traitor ships threw themselves against the Phalanx in a desperate attempt to shield the Blackstone fortress, silencing some of the great vessel's guns. But the remainder kept firing with relentless mechanical fury. Something within the Blackstone fortress shattered under the onslaught. Massive fissures appeared on its surface, and lurid purple light bled through the cracks. As the Phalanx limped away, its engines straining to clear the blast radius, a silent scream echoed across every living being in the Cadian Gate as the Blackstone fortress broke apart in a blinding flare of warp energy. When the glare faded, and a full third of Abaddon's Black Fleet was gone, snatched back by the tides of the warp, while more had burned out and crashed on Cardia's south pole. The destruction of the Will of Eternity was a turning point in the battle, but it was not a victory. Not yet. Abaddon, seeing his greatest weapon destroyed, made a decision that would define the end of the 41st millennium. The wreckage of the Blackstone fortress still hung in orbit above Cardia, massive fragments of alien material drifting like continent-sized mountains of dead stone. Abaddon ordered the fragments hurled down onto the surface of Cardia itself. Garradon, realizing what was about to happen, ordered every gun on the Phalanx to open fire on the descending wreckage, trying desperately to destroy the fragments before they could be captured by Cardia's gravity well. The Phalanx's remaining weapons blazed away at the falling mass, but it was not enough. The piece struck Cardia, hard, and the planet burned. The impact was catastrophic. The fragments slammed into the surface with the force of a planetary extinction event, destroying the network of ancient, Necron-built pylons that had held the Eye of Terror in check for millennia. The planet shuddered, its tectonic plates cracking under the impossible stress. Within hours, Cardia was tearing itself apart. But there were survivors. Against all odds, Imperial forces on the surface had endured the bombardment, and as the planet crumbled beneath their feet, they launched a desperate evacuation. Transport ships rose through demon-infested skies, their hulls battered by the fury of a world in its death throes, and every one of them flew toward the same beacon, the Phalanx. The great vessel waited in orbit, its hull scarred and its systems failing, but its docking bays open and its guns still firing at the Chaos ships that tried to intercept the evacuees, as Garradon waited until the very last transport had cleared the doomed planet before giving the order to withdraw. As the final ship docked and the last refugees stumbled into the Phalanx cavernous interior, the great vessel turned and led the ragged flotilla of surviving Imperial ships toward the edge of the Cadian system, where they could escape into the warp. The retreat from Cadia tested the Phalanx in ways that battle never could. The great vessel was not just a warship now, it was a refuge, a lifeboat. Thousands of displaced soldiers, traumatized civilians, wounded warriors, and shell-shocked survivors of one of the most devastating defeats in Imperial history were crammed into the Phalanx's vast interior. The docking bays that had once hosted cruisers of the Imperial Navy were now filled with refugee transports and battered shuttles. The corridors that had echoed with the footsteps of space marines now rang with the cries of children and the groans of the wounded. Garradon himself faced an impossible decision during the retreat. The transport ship, Pride of St. Seraphos, suffered catastrophic plasma drive failure, stranding it in the path of the pursuing Chaos fleet. Garradon took aboard what transport craft they could from the stricken vessel, but time was running out. The enemy was closing in, and every moment spent lingering to rescue stragglers put the entire evacuation fleet at risk, with what sources describe as a heartfelt curse, was an expression of anguish from a man trained since childhood to never leave a brother behind. Garradon ordered the Pride to be left to its fate. The ship and its remaining crew were sacrificed to buy time for the rest of the fleet to escape. It was the kind of decision that breaks the men who make it, but Garradon made it because the alternative was worse. losing the Phalanx, losing the evacuation fleet, losing everything. Behind them, Chaldea died. Oh, the fortress world that had guarded the Cadian Gate for 10,000 years, that had withstood 13 Black Crusades and uncounted lesser incursions, that had been home to some of the finest soldiers the Imperium had ever produced, cracked apart like an egg and was swallowed by the expanding eye of terror. The Great Rift tore across the sky, a wound in reality itself that split the galaxy in two, cutting off worlds, severing supply lines, and plunging the Imperium into the darkest chapter of its long and troubled history. But the survivors were safe. Carried away in the belly of the Phalanx, their rescuer battered and bleeding but unbowed, they would live to fight another day. The planet was lost, but the people endured, and the Phalanx, faithful as always, carried them home. Many of those Cadian survivors would later volunteer to serve in the Phalanx's Auric Auxilia, repaying the debt they felt they owed to the vessel and the chapter that had saved them from annihilation. The Cadians brought their martial traditions, their legendary discipline, and their unbreakable spirit to the Phalanx, enriching the vessel's human garrison in ways that went far beyond mere numbers. The Phalanx journey back to the Sol system was a somber one. The great vessel was badly damaged, carrying the accumulated wounds of the demon incursion, as the self-inflicted purge of its own corrupted sections, and the punishing battle over Cadia. Its engines were failing, its armor was breached in dozens of locations. Systems that had functioned, however imperfectly, for 10,000 years, were finally giving out under the strain of the vessel's most intense period of combat since the Horus Heresy. The Phalanx returned to orbit between Terra and Luna, where it settled into a position wreathed in repair cradles and servo armatures. At the mechanical arms of the Adeptus Mechanicus, reaching out to tend to its wounds like 100 devoted surgeons working on a single, impossibly large patient. The vessel was placed under the protection of the resurrected Roboute Guilliman, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, who ordered it to stand guard over Terra while repairs were underway. During the Battle of Luna, was when the remnants of Guilliman's Terran crusade burst from a hidden webway gate with the demonic forces of Magnus the Red in pursuit. The Phalanx scrambled Thunderhawk gunships to reinforce the Imperial forces. But the great vessel itself did not move. It could not. The repairs were too extensive, the damage too severe. The Phalanx was grounded, for all practical purposes, held in orbit by the machines that were trying to put it back together. But then something remarkable happened. In something that changed the Phalanx's trajectory and restored it to a level of operational capability that it had not enjoyed in thousands of years. The Shadowkeepers, one of the most secretive and formidable shield hosts of the Adeptus Custodes, made an extraordinary decision. These golden warriors were the wardens of the dark cells beneath the Imperial Palace, guardians of the terrible things that had been imprisoned in those lightless vaults since before the founding of the Imperium. The dark cells contained technologies and entities so dangerous that they had been locked away for 10 millennia, their very existence known only to the highest echelons of Imperial authority. In an act of solidarity that was described as uncharacteristic for the notoriously secretive Shadowkeepers, they opened one of the dark cells and provided the Imperial Fists with technology from within. The exact nature of this technology is not specified in the lore, but it was ancient, powerful, and capable of things that the standard tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus could only dream of. With this archaeotech in hand, the Imperial Fists began a program of restoration that went far beyond simple repair. The Phalanx was rebuilt. Not completely, not to the full glory of its Dark Age origins, but to a level of operational capability that it had not possessed in countless years. Systems that had been dead for millennia flickered back to life. Our weapons that had been dormant since before the War of the Beast roared to readiness. Sections of the vessel that had been sealed and abandoned for thousands of years were reopened, repaired, and restored to function. The price of this restoration was the acceptance of a permanent custodes presence aboard the Phalanx. The Imperial Fists begrudgingly agreed to host a visible contingent of custodians, understanding that this was part of the arrangement. But as we discussed earlier, they suspected, ye likely correctly, that additional custodians had already infiltrated the vessel, embedding themselves as a contingency against the possibility of the Phalanx being turned against Terra. In exchange for this slightly uncomfortable arrangement, the Imperial Fists received something priceless: their home reborn. The Phalanx operating at a level not seen since the days of the Horus Heresy, its ancient systems singing with renewed power, its weapons charged and ready, its engines burning with a fire that had been dimming for 10,000 years. The restored Phalanx would soon be tested in battle once more. The Fourth Tyrannic War erupted when a massive tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest and most aggressive Tyranid hive fleet ever recorded, fell upon the Bastia subsector with devastating force. The target was Sanctum, an anchor world of strategic importance, and the homeworld of the White Templars chapter. Lord Commander Solar Arcadian Leontus, one of the most powerful military commanders in the Imperium, chose the Phalanx as his headquarters for the campaign. This was a significant decision. By selecting the Phalanx as his command platform, Leontus was making a statement about the vessel's restored capabilities. He was also ordering the Phalanx to leave Terra's orbit for the first time in the current era, sending it deep into a war zone against an enemy that had proven capable of destroying worlds and consuming entire civilizations. Under the command of Torgaradon, now a veteran of countless battles and one of the last surviving Imperial Fists from before the formation of the Great Rift, the Phalanx transported Leontus, his command staff, and 3 full companies of Imperial Fists to the Bastia subsector. Upon arrival, the great vessel immediately engaged the Tyranid fleet, its restored weapon systems raining devastation upon the alien bioships. The Battle of Bastia was a brutal, grinding engagement. The Tyranids came in waves, their living ships hurling themselves at the Phalanx's defenses with the mindless, implacable hunger that characterizes the Great Devourer. Hundreds of Tyranid organisms attempted to board the great vessel directly, their bioforms designed to breach hull plating and consume the ship from within. But Garradon's leadership repeatedly pushed the invaders back, while the Phalanx's weapons fired continuously, reaping a terrible toll on the alien fleet. When the Custodies-led Soulblade's fleet arrived as reinforcements, the Phalanx contributed its own complement of fighter escorts to the combined assault, launching waves of drop pods and gunships through the skies over Sanctum's embattled strongholds. The Imperial forces eventually gained the upper hand, though the fighting was savage and the losses heavy. The Phalanx's role in the Fourth Tyrannic War demonstrated that the Custodies' restoration had been successful. The great vessel was once again a weapon of war, capable of projecting power across the galaxy and standing toe-to-toe with even the most fearsome enemies the Imperium faced. It was not the Phalanx of the Great Crusade. Not quite, but it was closer to that legendary vessel than it had been in thousands of years. And so, as we approach the end of our journey through the long and storied history of the Phalanx, let us take a moment to consider what this vessel truly represents. The Phalanx is more than a ship. It is more than a weapon, more than a fortress, more than a mobile monastery for a chapter of superhuman warriors. The Phalanx is a symbol of everything that humanity once was, and everything it struggles to remain. It was born in an age when humans could build wonders that rivaled the creations of alien civilizations millions of years their senior. An age when the limits of human achievement seemed bounded only by the imagination of those who dreamed the dreams. The Phalanx is a relic of that age, a physical reminder that humanity was once capable of greatness beyond measure. Every corroded circuit, every failing system, every dark and empty corridor that was once filled with light and purpose. These are the marks of a civilization that has lost its way. The Imperium of the 41st millennium cannot build a Phalanx, yet it can barely maintain the one it has. And that fact, more than any other, tells you everything you need to know about the state of human civilization in the grim darkness of the far future. It was claimed by a Primarch who embodied the very best of what the Imperium represented: duty, honor, unbreakable resolve. Rogal Dorn saw in the Phalanx a reflection of his own values, a fortress that could carry those values to every corner of the galaxy. Under his command, yes, the Phalanx became the standard around which the Imperial fists rallied, the home from which they launched their crusades, and the sanctuary to which they returned. Dorn is gone now, his fate uncertain, his body perhaps lost to the void. But the Phalanx endures, and in its endurance, Dorn's spirit lives on. It has survived 10,000 years of warfare, decay, treachery, and disaster. It has been invaded by demons, besieged by traitors, and slowly consumed by the entropy that claims all things in the grim darkness of the far future. It has been scarred by the weapons of a Blackstone fortress and healed by the secret technologies of the Adeptus Custodes. It has carried emperors and primarchs and chapter masters and common soldiers. It has been a weapon and a hospital and a cathedral and a lifeboat. It has been everything that humanity has needed it to be, in every era, against every enemy, and yet it endures, battered, scarred, and diminished, but never broken, never conquered, never surrendered. There is something profoundly moving about that endurance. In a setting defined by loss and decay, where everything is slowly falling apart and the darkness creeps a little closer with every passing year, the Phalanx stands as a defiant counterpoint to the gathering night. It is not immortal. It is not indestructible. It is, in many ways, as fragile as the civilization it defends, held together by the devotion of those who serve aboard it and the sheer stubbornness of its construction. But it refuses to die. It refuses to give in. It keeps going, keeps fighting, keeps sailing through the void, because that is what it was built to do. And as long as it keeps going, there is hope. The Phalanx endures because the men who crew it refuse to let it die. From the tech marines who whisper prayers to its ancient machine spirits, to the auric auxilia who patrol its endless corridors, to the Imperial fists who have called it home for 100 centuries, the great vessel survives because those who serve upon it make a choice every day to keep it alive, to repair what can be repaired, to maintain what cannot be replaced, to honor the legacy of those who came before by ensuring that the Phalanx is there for those who will come after. In a galaxy where everything is falling apart, where the darkness presses in from every direction and the laughter of dark gods echoes across the void, the Phalanx sails on, a golden light in the endless dark, a fortress among the stars, a home for heroes. Think about what it must be like to serve aboard the Phalanx, to walk corridors that Rogal Dorn himself once walked, to stand on a bridge where the Emperor of mankind once stood and looked out at the stars, to pray in shrines that are older than most civilizations, to know that the walls around you were built by hands so skilled that no one alive can replicate their work, to understand that you are part of a chain of guardians that stretches back 10,000 years, and that every day you serve, you add another link to that chain. The weight of that history must be extraordinary. The pride, the responsibility, the quiet knowledge that you are custodian of something irreplaceable. Every Imperial fist who has ever served aboard the Phalanx has carried that weight, and every one of them has borne it with the stoic, unyielding determination that defines the Sons of Dorn. They do not complain. They do not seek recognition. They simply do their duty as their Primarch taught them, and trust that the walls they maintain will hold. The Phalanx has seen the rise and fall of empires. It has watched Primarchs go to war and gods awake from slumber. It has carried the Emperor of mankind across the stars and borne his most loyal sons to battle. It has been the stage for some of the most desperate and magnificent moments in the long, bloody history of the Imperium. And its story is not over, not by a long shot. The Fourth Tyrannic War still rages. The Great Rift still bleeds across the sky. The enemies of humanity are more numerous and more dangerous than ever before. Somewhere in the void, the Phalanx sails on. its restored engines burning bright, its weapons charged and ready, its corridors alive with the footsteps of warriors who have sworn to defend humanity or die in the attempt. Tor Garadon stands on its bridge, one of the last connections to the chapter that existed before the galaxy was torn in two, and he looks out at the stars with the same quiet resolve that Dorn himself once showed. In the golden light of the strategium, beneath the watchful gaze of Dorn's severed hand, as the warriors of the Imperial fists renew their oaths and prepare for the wars to come, the ancient engines of the Phalanx rumble with renewed vigor, their power restored by technologies that predate the Imperium itself. The weapons hum with barely contained fury, ready to speak their deadly song against whatever foe dares to challenge the Emperor's dominion. And somewhere in the deep halls of the vessel, in corridors that have not seen a living soul in centuries, yet the echoes of 10,000 years of prayers and oaths and battle cries still linger in the stone. The ghosts of warriors long dead whisper to one another in the darkness, sharing stories of campaigns fought and won across the breadth of a galaxy that never stops demanding blood. The Phalanx, the largest Imperial ship in Warhammer 40,000, a fortress among the stars, a legend written in adamantium and gold, and it sails on, into the darkness, into the war, into the future. As always. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of the Phalanx, do me a favor and smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. If you are not already subscribed to Q on 40,000, now is the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you never miss an upload. We have so much more to explore in this incredible universe, and I cannot wait to share it with you. Until next time, stay cozy, stay curious, and remember, as in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but tonight there is also rest. Good night.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.